Yes.
Today's history bit is going to be coming from the Apostolic Canons, translated from the Ethiopic. A few days ago, I spent some time going through the Apostolic Canons in its entirety. And as I began to read and digest the information again, I found it important to share it with you. One of the reasons for sharing this information is because I find that it is important that the congregation begins to know the mind of the Shaliachim from the first century. We read scriptures in Matthew through Revelation, and we see the writings of these apostles in how they had to spend a great deal of time primarily troubleshooting situations in congregations. That's primarily what you see when you read through the writings. Maybe not necessarily Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Yochanan, or the book of Acts, but all of the other letters, in my own personal opinion, I would regard them as letters that are providing solutions to problems and giving answers to questions. That's what I call troubleshooting. However, when we look at the Apostolic Canons, what we see is a structural layout of the understanding of the apostles and the protocol that they laid out. I find it very significant. I often ask myself why this information was not shared with us when we were in Bible college or being trained in the Western Christian churches. Not much was ever mentioned about this particular information, to have ministry leaders and those who are ordained in the ministry to read the document. And as I read through the document in its entirety, I guess I would understand why this information was not brought forward as I felt it should have been. But as a servant of Yahuwah, I find that it is important in helping Zion to understand the ancient history of its faith in Mashiach, that we understand the mind of the apostles through this document. There are some things written in here that some of us are probably going to question, because it appears to be very foreign to the thinking and to the way in which things have been done in Western Christianity. Some will probably think that the document may appear to be very intolerant or inflexible when it comes to those who are believers and who are in ministry, when it comes to how they are chastised by spiritual leadership. But it is important that we understand the mind of these ancient apostles and the message that they were trying to present. This particular document that I'm reading from is of course, it's an English translation from the Ethiopic language. The Ethiopic language is a language that is a Semitic language. There are a number of languages in Ethiopia, but this particular one is from the Semitic-based language. So in the translation, there will be terminology that you will see that is no doubt from Western Christian theologians. And in the reading, I might use terms that we are more accustomed to as I'm reading. But I want us to really catch the mind and the message. So I'm going to read the first 6 canons. Now, each canon is basically a point. It is a point of teaching of cardinal importance to the Messianic Israelite community. And this document is regarded as one of the oldest of the Apostolic canons. There are, I believe, 6 of these in different languages that are held by the different sees. When we talk about sees, we're talking about episcopates, which has to do with 5 major episcopates of the ancient Messianic Israelite communities or churches. Rome was one of them. Greece was one of them. Syriac was one of them. Down in the region of the area of the Coptic and Ethiopian peoples, that was one of them. And so this particular document appears to be the oldest. So I want to read the translation. In the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God or one Elohim. This is the synod of the Christian church, or I will say Messianic congregation or community, which the apostles gave through the hand of Clemens, whom they early had sent. Canon 1. Concerning the number of bishops who should take part in the ordination of a bishop. A bishop should be ordained by 2 or by 3 bishops, but an elder and a deacon and the rest that are ordained shall be ordained by 1 bishop alone. Amen. Canon 2. Concerning the things which shall be brought upon the altar, if any bishop or elder brings anything else upon the altar of the Lord or Yahuwah, except that which we have commanded, that they shall bring and place there as an offering, they should bring either honey or milk or of birds or of beasts, anything else than that which our Lord has commanded, let him be deposed. Nor shall they be allowed to bring anything upon the altar except ears of grain and grapes in their seasons, and the oil of the lamps, and frankincense at the time of the Holy Eucharist. But the other fruits they shall send into the house, and they shall belong to the bishop and the presbyters. Presbyters is another term for elders. Only they should not bring them upon the altar. And the bishop and the presbyters and the other ordained persons shall divide these among themselves. Canon number 3. A bishop or an elder or a deacon shall not reject his wife under the pretext of a service of the Lord. But if they have rejected her, let them be separated from the church. Basically, what it means is that they need to stop their service in the congregation. And if they do not return them and bring them back, let them be deposed. Canon number 4. Concerning the day on which the Pesach, the Passover, should be celebrated, if any bishop or elder or deacon celebrates the holy Pesach with the Jews before the day and night are equal, that's the vernal equinox. That's what we would call the first day of spring, which generally occurs March 21st. It says, let him be deposed. Canon number 5. A bishop or an elder or a deacon shall not mix in with the doings of this world. But if they do this, let them be deposed. Now that phrase, let them be deposed, it just simply means that they're to be removed from their office of service. That's what that means. Canon number 6. But if a bishop or one of the priests who does not accept the Eucharist at the time of the solemnization mentions a reason for this, and if there is something that made him unworthy, let him be forgiven. But if he does not mention a reason, let him be deposed. For he was the leader that there should be sin to the people, and has caused them to take offense at him who has brought the Eucharist as though he had not brought it in purity. Now, I want to provide some explanation to these canons just for the sake of clarity. When we look at the first few canons, in particular, Canon 1 is very explicit. It's primarily giving information about the order when it comes to the ordination of those who are in the position of bishop. Now, mind you, during this particular time in the 1st century and 2nd century, the office of bishop is synonymous with what we will call today a senior pastor. That was the equivalent of that time, because the bishops were bishops over whole cities. And at that time, it wasn't, or shall I say, the Messianic community wasn't as large and extended as we would see it today. And so when you have more numbers, you have to facilitate those numbers with more leaders. But these individuals who were called bishops were primarily the senior pastors over the congregations, but it was not only over just that local congregation, but primarily over the whole city. And so whoever was the established leader over the entire city, that was their jurisdiction, their realm. And other ministers couldn't just come in and start works in that region or that realm. Okay? And of course, when we read through all of this, you're going to see how the structure and order and governance was understood. When we look at Canon 2, we find here in this canon information regarding what is to be brought and placed upon the altar, offerings, things of that type. During that time, people not only brought money, but they also brought animals. They brought produce, because at that particular time, people were still very agricultural in their lifestyle. And so those items were to be taken to a particular place in the house of the bishop, and it was to be shared among those ministry leaders. But those items that were to be left upon the altar were primarily for the service of the altar, which had to do with the ears of grain, that's the wheat, that would be used for the making of the bread. The grapes would be used for the making of the wine. The oil would be used for the lighting of the lamps and the candles. The frankincense would be used for the incense. So what we see in the text, we see in early history of those particular items that were provided for the burning of the candles, the incense, the Eucharist, which is what we refer to as the communion, when we have the bread and the wine. All of that is a part of this ancient practice. So we see these things here noted in this ancient document. Those items were the things that were allowed to be brought up on the altar. Canon 3, it gives information about how ministry leaders are to stay with their spouses. This is very interesting. It says that a ministry leader couldn't say, well, you know what? I don't need you in my life anymore. I'm serving the Lord now. They didn't feel that way. They felt like, well, you're married. You need to stay with your wife. Yeah. You don't cast her aside because you're preaching the gospel now. What you begin to see in these canons is this mindset that the apostles firmly believed in marriage. They firmly believed in making a marriage work, and that the preaching of the Besorah did not cut her out of the picture. Yes. We don't always see this same mindset in our contemporary era today, but this is something that's to be noted. We also see in canon number 4 something concerning the day on which the Pesach is to be celebrated. Wow, you mean to tell me that the ancient Messianic Israelite community still celebrated the Passover? You mean when the Western Christian church tells you that all of those things were done away with, that, you know, that's all been fulfilled in the Messiah, and we don't do that stuff anymore? Nope, this ancient document, what it says is that concerning the day on which the Pesach should be celebrated, period. Yeah. So we see in this document that the Pesach was still being celebrated. The following information records that it's not supposed to be done on the day before the vernal equinox. And the reason for that statement being made is because at this particular time, the Messianic Israelite community, which was known as the sect of the Nazarenes, still followed the ancient way in which the calendar was to be determined and the months were to be determined, to look up in the sky and check to see if the crescent moon was there. But what had happened going into the 2nd century, because this document is regarded as a 2nd century document. Going into the 2nd century, the Jews, as you see the phrase, the Jews, is referring to the sect of the Pharisees. Anytime you see the term Jews mentioned here in the 2nd century moving forward, it is referring specifically to the sect of the Pharisees and those who follow them. Because the two major sects at this time were now facing a very serious divide. And the reason why it's stated that you do not celebrate the Pesach with the Jews before the vernal equinox is because at this particular time, remember, this is a Messianic Israelite community. This is how they regarded themselves. So you had brothers and uncles and cousins and probably grandparents who were part of the sect of the Nazarenes, and then you had family who were following the sect of the Pharisees that said, no, we're not going to believe in that Yahshua. So when they would celebrate the Moedim, they would celebrate the Moedim together because they were still blood relatives. Yeah. This makes sense to everybody. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So what the apostle said is that when you celebrate it with those who are Pharisaic Jews, then don't do it before the vernal equinox. But what we have is a clear evidence that the Pesach was still being celebrated. Canon number 5, it basically tells us that those who are in positions of ministry service in the congregation are not supposed to mix in with the world. And of course, the understanding of what the world is during that time has to do with the pagan, Greek, and Roman community. And then when we look at canon number 6, the last canon, it primarily has to do with the significance of eating of the Eucharist. Now, I want to define the term Eucharist just so that you all understand. Because a lot of times when we hear the term Eucharist, the first thing that comes to our mind is the Catholic Church. When we hear the word Eucharist, this word Eucharist is a Greek word, and this Greek word is associated with the Hebrew word shalomim. That's the word it's associated with. Now, I've done a teaching on this where we talk about the shalomim and we deal with the word, because the word Eucharist means how do you say it? It means thanksgiving and well-being sacrifice. That's what it means. The thanksgiving and well-being sacrifice, which is what the shalomim is, what is called the peace offering. All right? So this is a Greek term referring to this shalomim that was still being practiced. And it was a very significant part of the celebrations on the Shabbat, just as we celebrated on each Shabbat. You notice we don't have a once a month communion celebration. You know how that's done. You know, when I was a part of the Baptist church at one point in time, or part of the Pentecostal church at one point in time, once a month you would have the communion. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But this is something with the shalomim that is done every Shabbat. That's how it was done. Well, it was a very important and significant thing to do. And so when this canon talks about a spiritual leader not partaking of the shalomim, they needed to have a reason, basically. Because if you did not partake of the shalomim, it was kind of like a clue to everybody else that you committed a sin. Because in their thinking and in their understanding, it is something that must be done. But if a person felt unworthy, then they were to confess that sin or acknowledge that. And it says here that the sin would be forgiven, of course. But if a spiritual leader, now notice this is talking about the spiritual leaders right here. It's not talking about the congregational members. It's talking about the spiritual leaders. And if the spiritual leader is not willing to confess their sin, if they know they sin and they're not going to partake of it and not willing to confess it, then basically the mind of the apostles was, you don't need to be in this seat of service. Yeah. Because you're being a hypocrite. If you have sin in your life, be transparent. Confess it. Yeah, that's right. And if you're not going to partake of the shalomim, then make it known. This is what the canon is saying. If you're a spiritual leader, make it known. Let everyone know why. And this was all about transparency and making sure that as a spiritual leader, the example was provided to the people. And so I trust that this information has stirred your imagination a little. I know that when we read this, it definitely is going to shine some light on the current religious culture and how there's a great difference from the thinking and the understanding of doing the work of service in comparison to how the apostles saw things when it had to do with doing the work of service. Yeah. And so with that, we bless the Almighty.